We know with 5th edition, as well as a lot of the new age RPG systems, the player characters tend to be very powerful, very hard to kill, and the character creation process is very in-depth. Now, when we think about those OSR old school games, the character creation is very quick many times, and you're expected not to live very long. And your backstory, sometimes for some people it doesn't seem to matter. So out of these two systems, D&D 5th edition, Shadow Dark, the newest of the OSRs, one of the newest, which supports Sword and Sorcery. Now, before we even get there, what is Sword and Sorcery? Now, in my mind, as soon as when I think about Sword and Sorcery, I think about grittiness, roughneck stuff.
Welcome to the Roughnecks.
Rico's Roughnecks!
Let's look up some definitions online. So here's Bing AI. Real quick, we're not going to go through the full text, but I just underlined some of the more specific or things that really point out to what Sword and Sorcery is. One that says personal battles rather than world-saving missions, and emphasizes personal conflicts. Okay, this is Bing AI. Now, if we go to Google, we see something similar. It's personal stakes rather than epic world-saving quests. Okay, so that's helpful. And if we dig a little bit deeper, again, looking for Sword and Sorcery here on Wikipedia, again, just looking at those underlying exciting and violent adventures, focuses on personal battles, often pit morally great characters against each other, considered darker, grittier, more violent. There's the word grittier, maybe that's where I got it from. I found this world building academy, and it immediately starts pointing to the origin of Sword and Sorcery, which is from this writer, Fritz Leiber. Okay, and that writer emphasizes how his stories, or at least the stories that he was trying to tell, were about personal conflicts and the intimate scale of the stakes that sets it apart from the other epic fantasies that are out there. And so basically, Sword and Sorcery comes down to personal battles happening in local regional areas. You have morally gray characters, and it's supposed to be a very violent type of game. So when we think of, let's say, Aragorn and Conan, like, do those things actually fall in line with that? I mean, I saw Aragorn cutting some heads off. Blood wasn't flying. Everybody was cutting some heads off, and I saw him chopping down a lot of orcs. So it is definitely kind of violent in that world. And of course, if you've seen the Conan movies, I saw the Conan movies, but except for maybe the first one, The Barbarian. And if you watch, even with Momoa, it's a little more violent there. But what about the comics? The comics are great. They also show a lot of violence. Between Aragorn and Conan, which one of these is Sword and Sorcery? When you look up what is Sword and Sorcery versus heroic fantasy, it always points to Conan the Barbarian or Conan comics, anything by Robert E. Howard, who's considered to be the father of the Sword and Sorcery genre. Okay, so this brings us back to Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition and Shadow Dark. Okay, can those have that Sword and Sorcery element, that personal battles, that local regional area where everything occurs, morally great characters, violent? And the answer to me is, I think all these things are DM options, right? So like if you play Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition or Shadow Dark, it's really up to the DM whether or not they want to make it about personal battles and make it regional, how violent. Remember, now violence doesn't equal deadly, even though Shadow Dark is probably more deadly than 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. You can still have a violent game in 5th edition as well. And morally gray characters, that's something that the characters decide to do. So again, which of these two actually supports Sword and Sorcery style games? There's a bunch of old Dungeons & Dragons games as well as other older systems that are considered a little more grittier, a little more tougher. And then somewhere about 3rd edition, things kind of started getting out of hand in terms of action economy and the things that your character could do. And these are considered more new age, right? And at the same time, when all these new age games were being created, there was a rebirth of the old school stuff called the old school Renaissance, such as Osric, Castle and Crusades, Old School Essentials. These are kind of carbon copies of the old stuff and brought back that old grittier, more aka violent games. With the all newer stuff, D&D 3.5, 4th edition, D&D 5.0, the new Pathfinder, Dragonbane, Dagger, Hard Draw, Steel, these new age games, are they more Sword and Sorcery than the old school games? So there's really a big emphasis in the new age games to really personalize or make that character creation very in-depth versus all the OSR stuff where the character creation is very quick. There's very little thought given to the backstory. Here's an example of Shadow Dark's list for backstories. You can see it's very just one-liners. Whereas if you compare that to D&D 5th edition, there's a lot more detail, a lot more you have to work with. And on top of that, the character creation's more in-depth, right? You got to think about racial bonuses, where to give your skills, different skills you can acquire, different weapon masteries, different toolkits you might want to have. And a lot of people know that people do not want your character to die. Now, if you think about those old school players, the grognards, which I'm pretty much part of the grognards, the old school players, they tend to not care about the death of your PC.
When the honey badger cares, it doesn't give a shit.
And this is pretty true. I actually have this mentality as well that the PC shouldn't really matter in the sense that they don't have to live, right? The game should be deadly. And if you look at if you look at a bunch of other YouTubers out there, dungeon tubers out there, they're actually the old school guys, the grognards, are gonna actually tell you the same thing, that it really doesn't matter if your character survives or not. Deal with it.
The honey badger cares, it doesn't give a shit.
And when it comes to deadliness, the new age are considered less deadly, and the reason they're considered less deadly is because your PCs have way more hit points, healing spells, buffing spells, stuff like that. All of that keeps your player alive a lot longer. And so therefore in OSR games, because you have less hit points, there's less maneuvers, less actions you can take, your PCs are essentially more dispensable, and they tell you do not get attached to those PCs, that they might actually die. You might not even make it past 1, 2, or 3rd levels. So again, the grognards, the old school guys, we tend to not care.
The honey badger cares, it doesn't give a shit.
This brings up the question of these two systems, which of them is actually supporting a sword and sorcery style? Not that you can't tailor the game to be more sword and sorcery like, but from the get-go, which one of these two systems is going to give you more of a sword and sorcery feel? And I think the answer is the new age games, because there's so much invested in those PCs, in those character creations, all that time you spend looking into the backstory, writing the backstory, where like if you look at any of these old school Dungeons and Dragons games or the new OSR games, they tend to not care about your background. Like, you're nobody, you could die at any time.
The honey badger cares, it doesn't give a shit.
Now it doesn't mean that these other games can't, because I know for a fact I've seen videos of my forefather, Matt Colville, actually saying he doesn't care too much about player backstories.
GM doesn't seem to care about their character. Well, that's because it's your job to care about your character. The game is not about your backstory.
And so therefore it doesn't become about the player characters, it becomes about whatever Matt Colville or whatever he thinks his table should be investigating or doing.
Father, forgive me for my branch delivery.
So this is a dungeon master choice. The dungeon master does have to decide whether or not they want to tailor their game first towards to a sword and sorcery style game where the individual player matters, and maybe you should pay attention to those backstories and actually, you know, make games based on those backstories so they can complete those personal missions. Whether or not it's going to be world encompassing or very local and regional, that's a DM option. Whether the character is going to be morally gray, I would argue in a D&D 5.0 game, you're more likely to have morally gray characters because you care about that backstory, why they're morally gray. And when it comes to violence, again, that's a DM option. It could be a little, you know, fluffy puff type game, which I've played in before, or it can be a very gritty game where heads are being chopped off and blood's flying everywhere, or you have to make very morally gray decisions during the gameplay, and that's a DM option. We got all those definitions of sword and sorcery from our various different types of resources, and the one thing that really stands out is personal stakes, personal battles. Because new age systems like Dungeons and Dragons or Tales of the Valiant or Pathfinder really spend a lot of time for PCs to develop those backgrounds, really get to know the history of their races, their classes descriptions. All these things are more in depth in the new age games versus the old style games. This directly supports sword and sorcery games. It's not like the other ones can't do it or the OSR games can't do it. It's just the new age games tend to support sword and sorcery much more because you do not want to just sacrifice those players' characters. If you don't agree with me, disagree with me, please tell me what you think. I'd love to engage with you. I'm Don Franco 3. This is RPG Boons, where we talk about everything RPG, and everything is RP. If you like to cut out my gibberish, hit the buttons. You know what to do. I'll get back to you. Until next time.
The honey badger cares, it doesn't give a shit.